Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Mary Beth Weisberg, the Partnership Director at the Minneapolis Downtown Council. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders. This conversation will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, so you can feel free to watch it later and share it with others. As we kick off the program today, please feel free to introduce yourself with your name and company in the chat. If you have questions that you would like answered by the panelists at the end of the presentation, please use the Q&A function. We'll answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the program. Now I'd like to introduce Steve Kramer, President and CEO of the Minneapolis Downtown Council, who will introduce today's presenters and program.
Thanks, Mary Beth, and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this really important and impactful conversation about cultural change in the workplace, part of our ongoing series of conversations with influential and important leaders of color in the business community here in Minneapolis. We also have another interesting session coming up before the end of the year on December 2nd. We'll be jointly hosting with our colleagues at Easttown Business Partnership a session with Ron Wirtz, who is the research director at the Federal Reserve Bank, getting clarity on the economics of COVID-19 with the Fed. So that will be quite interesting. I hope you can join us on December 2nd, same time, same station here at 11 o'clock. Really want to thank Shaw Lundquist, one of our really important and successful minority-owned construction firms, for sponsoring today's event. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dan Collison, who actually will introduce all the panelists and facilitate our conversation from here. So Dan, turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thank you to everybody who's taken the time to either participate in this webinar live now or who is watching it later. I posted on LinkedIn about this forum that these leaders that we have on today's panel have incredibly hard-earned wisdom about bringing cultural change to our companies and organizations, and each one of them represents not only leaders in their sectors, which we're going to hear specifically about bringing a more inclusive company culture to their sectors. They are people who think widely and broadly, and so I am very pleased to host this conversation. And I will also frame this in a larger conversation that the Downtown Council's had throughout this year, following up on the incredibly difficult conversations and all that happened around the killing of George Floyd, Minneapolis and George Floyd, and all that is in play right now for helping us as a society and as a marketplace to understand diversity, equity, inclusion. We have hosted, this would be the third conversation, with the first being just really listening to our leaders of color, how they see the world, how they envision the marketplace becoming more diverse and inclusive and equitable. And then the second one actually focused on individual growth. How do we grow as competent, culturally competent leaders and learn how to be allies for myself? I'm a white, cisgendered, straight male. How do I show up and appear in spaces and bring leadership to all the organizations that I'm a part of or influence to be more inclusive? And today, and this is what I'm excited about and why I'm glad you're paying attention, listening in, we're going to focus on institutional change. And of course, that is the burden of every good leader. So as we kick this off, I would love for each of our presenters today to do a lightning round of just kind of a very quick brief, describe the work of their organization and their leadership role in it. And why don't we start with Dr. Tanya Jackman Hampton, who is the Chief People and Culture Officer for Hennepin Healthcare. Why don't you step up first?
Good afternoon. I am delighted to see everyone. And now as you see me, I can tell that you cannot really see me because it's kind of dark, and I apologize. It's been a wonderful day. I'm sort of being sarcastic because I've had some wonderful technology challenges that were unbeknownst to me, but I'm delighted to be here. And in terms of the understanding of work and journey that I've been on, I will start out with, I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota, born and raised, and have been here all of my life. I left for 2 years and went to Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. And I then came back home and have been here ever since. And during my early times in my career really started out in the employment and labor law space. Certainly had some opportunities before that, but I'll say that that's really when I started the mold of my own development as well as better understanding organizations. During that time, I operated as a paralegal and then shifted onward to the capacity of an HR business partner through some different job changes and went on to Best Buy. And what was molded there was the brinks of some of the culture change work that I did. Along with, as I evolved from Best Buy, I went on to then Ecolab, came back to Best Buy, but with the Accenture hat. And that too became a time where there was some culture change efforts that I will talk about. And then fast forward from Accenture, I went on to Medtronic, and that started my molding of healthcare and being in the medical device space and on better understanding how those types of organizations function and worked. From Medtronic, I went on to Health Partners. From Health Partners, I went on to Planned Parenthood. And then from Planned Parenthood, I went on to Cook Ross, and now I'm at Hennepin Healthcare. So now that you understand that kind of path, it's important as a leader that I have formed that my own self journey has impacted how I view and see organizations. And so those changes that I've gone through personally have made me a more adaptable, flexible individual. And that I think is essential for anyone that is leading a culture change for their organization. Coupled with that, I would say that what's also important is being willing to understand how you bring other people along. In my path, I have had to describe why did I leave, what were the roles that I had, and so I became very creative and built up my own capacity to be able to build confidence for myself and confidence for others that I had had the right steps along the way to illustrate that I was a change leader, to illustrate that I had the capacity to change organizations and work with teams and individuals. But more specifically, from a storytelling perspective around the culture change, the work that I started really going deep on as it relates to change happened at Best Buy. At Best Buy, some of you may remember, Best Buy was in Eden Prairie and was moving to Richfield. And in that transition, we needed to make a commitment to the city of Richfield of how we were going to show up and not create a lot of traffic trouble, quite frankly, in that Richfield area. And so we needed to undergo an organizational transformation, which included logistics, all the way through ensuring that our employees were able to be in their new space at a time where they were still doing their standing jobs, and needing to really think about how they will evolve in the new place. And so that was culture change. Excuse me. With that culture change, that meant that we needed to do policy changes, mission, vision, values, etc. And that taught me the criticality of getting organizational input. And so one takeaway around culture change, I would say what's necessary is ensuring that you've got that organizational input. Second, what I established and understood there was having change leaders that you partner with to be able to have catalysts across the organization to do the change that you're wanting to do with the organization. Very specifically, too, you all might remember that Best Buy is known for a results-oriented work environment or flexible work environment. And so I actually was the impetus or the person that partnered with others to bring that about, and it evolved over time into the results-oriented work environment. But that was a transformation and culture change for the organization. And how we did it was really partnering with business leaders and employees around the organization to understand what their needs were so that we could translate their job in their office space into their job at home. And so that took the necessity for us to do a needs assessment, identify the strategic priorities from that needs assessment, and then begin implementing in partnership with everyone in the organization. So hopefully what you're taking from that message is that organizational change cannot happen without partnering with others and collaborating to be able to really implement the change that you're trying to implement. So that's a synopsis. I know we're going to have lots of other speakers. I could go on. There's been changes I've had along the way. Medtronic was another example. And one of the questions I was asked of how does that change that I've done or culture change relate to the healthcare industry that I'm in? And at Medtronic, it was a very global organization, and we were implementing diversity and inclusion as a strategy. That too had similar resemblance to the change at Best Buy, at which you needed to create really a key understanding business case and partner with multiple people across the organization to implement the change. So I'll stop there because I don't want to hog all the time, and we could probably, like I said, go on forever, but I'm happy to keep going with others.
Well, and we have some more rounds. So thank you, Dr. Hampton, for that opening reflection. Turning to Hoyt Shao, I think it'd be good, Hoyt, for you to pivot to maybe combining an opening introduction, but let's mirror what Dr. Hampton just reflected as far as inserting some of your personal journey, professional journey, but bring us into your world. Construction leader at the very highest level, nationally recognized firm, regional leader. But who are you and how do you relate to all of that? And bring us into a little bit of that personal journey, just as Dr. Tanya Hampton did.
Thanks, Dan. Like Dr. Hampton, I was born and raised in the Twin Cities as well, and went to the university, went to high school here, grew up in the area, went to the University of Minnesota and graduated from there and started working in our family business. So unlike Dr. Hampton, I had more direct route right into Shaw Lundquist. A little background, Shaw Lundquist is a general contracting company that was founded back in 1974 by my father, Fred Shaw, and a partner, Lyle Lundquist. And the name of our company, Shaw Lundquist, came about because my father started in the industry in the late 40s, and he kept our family surname, but for business, he used Fred Shaw to make it easier for people, because back then it was more unusual to have a different last name. So with that reputation of Fred Shaw, he kept the Shaw Lundquist name when he started our business in 1974 with Lyle Lundquist. When I stepped into the business, it was a smaller general contractor that really looked at performing a lot of public bid work and doing some work with some private corporations. Through my time frame, developed throughout the business from a project manager or working on job sites to becoming a project manager to helping with some estimating to leading some of the operations and eventually becoming the president and CEO, the position that I'm in now. So I try to be a leader to our team and help guide the values and purpose that we've developed through our history and try to continue to make sure that we're following those values and our purpose of building better lives. And when we talk about that, that's the thing that we try to help motivate our team and make sure people are on board toward the direction of creating better lives for people, not just the people working on our project sites, but what those projects are being used for and how we can really impact people. As far as creating change within the organization or as a bigger ecosystem in the construction market, construction has been, as an industry, I think more fortunate in its past history of inclusion and diversity and equity, where back in the 1960s, late 60s, there was a push to get more minority and business, women businesses involved in government programs and contracting. And through those, corporations picked up on the value of having diverse suppliers as well, starting out with General Motors and the other auto producers, and then IBM stepping in as well in the late 60s during the civil unrest back then. So to today, there's many corporations that have diverse supplier inclusion goals for how they contract their work and getting more minority, women, LGBT, and veteran-owned businesses involved. For the area that I really focus in is trying to create opportunities or share my knowledge around minority contracting, being involved at the higher national level with the National Association of Minority Contractors, locally with the local chapter in the past, and now with MEDA, which is a Metropolitan Economic Development Association that helps entrepreneurs of color succeed in the Twin Cities, and also working on other organizations that are starting to have more thought about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the areas I really try to share is about procurement and how companies can view that as a business advantage for them and the benefits that come with it, and some of the best practice on developing those programs, especially for construction, since that's the market we're in. And sometimes with a lot of corporations, that's a back office operation. So sometimes it doesn't get quite the same focus as other areas. So that would be something that I help focus in with companies to talk about those opportunities for prime contracting or tier 1 contracting with a general contractor like us for their building needs. And then having us be committed to include MBE, WBE, or diverse firms to create tier 2 opportunities, and even flowing that down to tier 3. And in addition to the actual contracting dollars, some owners and government clients especially have goals around employment of minority and women individuals on the job sites as well. But for today, mainly focusing on procurement and the contracting side.
That's remarkable, Hoyt. And I'll just comment before turning to Kevin Lindsay. You're really talking about how companies need to be looking upstream and downstream. And by upstream, I mean to the talent recruitment, to who it is that's participating, that makes the economy and the marketplace and everything work well. But then downstream, like, well, what's the result of all of this? And that speaks to public policy. It speaks to opportunities. It speaks to helping all facets of the society racially work. And that feeds back to upstream. And so I've always appreciated, like, you're all hands on deck. I mean, sometimes company leaders kind of live in their company. And I've always seen and known you to be someone who's in the company, out of the company, and up and downstream. And so thank you for that relevancy, and we'll dig into that a little bit more. Well, Kevin, Lindsay, let's turn to you. Let's, again, sort of mirror what we're doing here, which is a little bit of a combo deal of personal introduction, as well as digging into a little bit of your broader work. We're so privileged to have Kevin Lindsay, former Commissioner of Human Rights for the state of Minnesota, an incredible attorney, and now CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center. And he's been with us before. Thank you for taking the time. Bring us into that personal story, and then kind of how you see the world at this moment, and then we'll dig into deeper questions in a few minutes.
Yeah, appreciate the introduction and appreciate being on this panel with Hoyt and Dr. Hampton. My story is one of coming to Minnesota for job opportunities. Specifically, that job opportunity is with a firm called Oppenheimer, Wolf and Donnelly. At that point in time, we were about 250 attorneys, and it was the case that I immediately got thrown into the employment and labor group. So I always view myself first and foremost as an employment attorney. It's been very valuable, I think, on this journey throughout my legal career. As has been mentioned or is known by some, is that I also had the privilege of serving as a Commissioner of Human Rights for the state of Minnesota. And as the Commissioner of Human Rights under the state of Minnesota, under Governor Mark Dayton, had an opportunity to set workforce participation goals that Hoyt referenced, and also to encourage the state as it relates to doing more in the space of contracting. What I would also say, though, it doesn't get as much attention, but it does exist within the statute, and that is using education, bringing people together to reduce tensions around racial discrimination and finding solutions to community problems. So I like to think of myself, especially now as the CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center, of kind of seeing it from all different phases. As an outside counselor, as an attorney, as someone who has been in the public sector, trying to encourage inclusive practices, and now in the current position as the employer, as the individual who's making decisions in contracting, and also because of the uniqueness of the Minnesota Humanities Center, seeking to promote the humanities, of creating a healthy ecosystem. What I would say echoes a lot of what Dr. Hampton says. As CEOs or leaders of organization, it's critically important. There's an adage from, I think it's James Baldwin, it's important because people see what you do. And that's sometimes more impactful of hearing what you say. So to the extent that you are modeling, you're identifying a plan, you are supporting leaders within your organization that are supporting this is key and critical. That is very important for all of us within this respective space. I think it's also very telling what Hoyt was saying is not just seeing yourself within your organization, but also appreciating that you also are an environment or an ecosystem. So as leaders, what you are quiet on can be very telling. What you raise your voice on and what you take time to sort of amplify and uplift can also be very telling in setting a healthy environment, a healthy ecosystem, not only for your business to be successful now, but well into the future. So let me take a step back within that. So the Minnesota Humanities Center, our vision changed, and that was one of the very first things that I was tasked to do, is to change that vision statement to really align it going forward. So our new vision is a just society that is curious, connected, and compassionate. So for us, curious, come to conversations with open hearts, open minds, authentically listening to one another, connected, seeing our lives intertwine in a garment of mutual destiny, compassionate, motivated toward action. So for us, this is something that we seek to instill within our action, within our organization, and then also how we partner with vendors, scholars that we work with, and into the broader community. And that can take us into the area of education, working with school districts. It can take us into spaces where we create humanities programs, such as How Can We Breathe, in which we bring scholars and people from the community to talk about issues after the death of George Floyd. It can also bring us into spaces of civic renewal. So when we do grants with foundations such as the Mellon Foundation, working on democracy building initiatives. And we can say more, but how do we as leaders, I think, and Hoyt is a good example, Dr. Hampton, and what she has been doing as well as a consultant, and then also working internally within organizations. How do you live this holistically in all areas of what you do?
Kevin, thank you for that. It was almost like a book in itself. It was really, really rich and deep and wide. Thank you for every single path. And I'll encourage everyone who's on this webinar, pull that cursor back 4 minutes to hear that again. I just want to highlight everything he just said is like books, chapters in a book. And if you just listen to that, you'd be in great shape. Well, pivoting back to Dr. Tanya Jackman Hampton. So just sort of building a little bit on what you shared and what we've just heard from Hoyt and Commissioner Lindsay as well. And I know you've only been at Hennepin Healthcare for like a month, maybe 90 days tops. So grateful. I know the CEO and the whole organization is thrilled to have your leadership. But if you could try to, and again, this is about just leadership, imagination, and I know you're only in that role 90 days, but I think a lot of people on this call or watching it are also feeling in a disruptive space, or they're trying something new, or maybe they've been hired to lead DE&I for an organization they hadn't been in. And so how would you bring us into your brain space? Like, you're now in a healthcare system that has over $1 billion a year annual income and revenue and expenses, and it's a public-facing institution. It's one of the leading trauma one in the state. Pressures are intense because we're the safety net hospital. And I know from firsthand, being on the community advisory board, that there are racial tensions that exist between patients and staff, and staff and staff, and staff and patients, as all public-facing institutions have. How do you get into this to provide leadership, to build out a culture of inclusion?
Well, Dan, that was wonderful. And I, actually got a little bit of a goosebump of thinking people in my brain space. It's a little scary, but nonetheless, I will invite you and you can tell me whether or not you enjoy it, or just hopefully I can give some tidbits. I think when I look at diversity inclusion, I'll be honest with you, and health equity for that matter, but I'll put that to the side because that actually is more important than when I'm if you would have asked me 30 work, the reason is I grew up in a suburban school, often was treated differently because of the color of my skin, even though I was not allowed to belong in certain situations or experiences. And so as a result, over my life, I heard the word diversity earlier in my career, and I would cringe because I was triggered based off of the life experiences that I had had as a young girl. I was fortunate enough, fast forward, to have a mentor while I was at Health Partners, which was when I was responsible to globally, or nationally in their case, launch diversity inclusion for the healthcare organization. And I was expressing to her my concerns about sometimes being triggered and feeling uncomfortable, feeling like I wanted to express certain things, but concerned about being liked, and also letting her know that I felt some upset that was coming at me more so than I had in a while, because some of that triggering happened earlier in my career and dissipated. But as I was in this more senior role, it surfaced, frankly. And she told me, she said, you know, you got to turn that pain into passion. I'll never forget that. And it gave me a sense of recognizing that sometimes we can get distracted by the things that hurt us. And the reality is if we can re-engineer that or flip it, it actually can be the very thing that can drive us to create change in the spaces that we are in. The second thing that has been incredibly important for me, and as it relates to being at Hennepin, is that being from here, frankly, when I raised my children, they would tell you that mom said, and dad, I'll put him on the spot, but we said together that Minnesota, it's cold here. Ooh, we can't wait to leave. And so all their life, that's what they heard. But wait, the thing about that is I have legacy roots here. So my grandfather is Cecil E. Newman. My grandmother is Launa Q. Newman. Both of them have namesake streets here in the state of Minnesota. My family are creators of the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder. My cousin now leads it. And so that's something to be proud of. But frankly, why I was proud was because it supported me as a person and allowed me to become the Black woman that I am today. But at the same token, I didn't reflect on it as a sense of what would root me here. And when George Floyd was murdered, it occurred to me that I caught the bus on 4th Avenue. The killing occurred. So as you can imagine, sometimes I would walk from 4th Avenue to Chicago Avenue. I also had another grandmother who lived on 40th and Clinton. So when the murder occurred, I knew that my daughter was in the marches, the social unrest that was occurring and social justice marching that occurred. She was involved in that. I also took my son from our house in South Minneapolis, about 20 blocks from 38th and 4th and 38th in Chicago, and drove him to my brother's home, who lived about a block from the 3rd precinct that was caught on fire. Then from there, I took him down to the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder, and while he knew about the paper, while he knows about his grandmother and grandfather, he never connected them in terms of where their streets were and in terms of where George Floyd was murdered. And so it regrounded me. Juxtaposition or alongside all of this, I was in the midst of my process with Hennepin Healthcare to come on board. I felt very connected to the organization because it was healthcare. It's something that I am passionate about. But to be quite frank, based on the patients, the community, the people that we interact with, I knew I needed to be here. I knew I needed to cancel the trip that I thought it would make which was to DC to go work for the consulting firm that I was at. Oh, by the way, they canceled it for me. Well, they had to because COVID. But nonetheless, I knew that it wasn't time for me to leave, that it was necessary for me to be a part of the change that was so much, or is so much, has been so much needed here in Minnesota. And Hennepin Healthcare is positioned prime to address healthcare disparities along with all of our other healthcare partners here in the Twin Cities. With us being the #1 trauma care center, I couldn't think of a better place that I'd be prouder of to be able to try to create change both in the community and in the organization. And so from a healthcare perspective, health equity perspective, it's really looking at it end to end, from how are we being person-centered with our employees to how are we being person-centered with the patients and the community that we serve, so that we can minimize the issues of people not being treated fairly, whether it's about how they interact with one another, and in particular from a healthcare perspective, and so that we can dissipate or eliminate the disparities that exist here in the Twin Cities and be a role model for the nation, because we're still sitting at the bottom as it relates to the disparities that exist in Minnesota. And I want to be a part of that, and I'm confident that there are others, Kevin, as well as how I'm really trying to think about how do we create this change together, plus with other leaders that exist. So with that, I've said a lot, but that's part of my story.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'll turn to Hoyt in just a second here. I do want to comment that what I'm already noticing as we've gone round robin here is that to lead culturally impactful institutional change, you as the leader have to keep reintegrating, have to keep rethinking how you are personally working and moving within this world. And that because there's so many inputs, like what do you do with all that's coming at you? How do you transform that as you then lead and externalize your wisdom and your leadership? Like that work has to run parallel. You can't just be in the abstract and building systems. You have to keep doing that inner work of integration. And thank you especially for more background on some of your historic connections to essential, particularly African-American institutions. Well, Hoyt, my question to you that has me just opening some questions. So Shell Lundquist is nationally recognized as one of the largest firms. And I know in that world, minority-owned firms is used. I just want to pin that the word minority can be problematic because it's sort of lumping cultures in, it's sort of categorizing, and it's just problematic in my professional opinion. But your company is a leader. And yet I know that the work of even very diverse organizations remaining diverse and creating a culture of a company culture that becomes multicultural. How do you do that? And maybe even you as a person, how do you integrate in this theme of like you as a leader, the institution, even though you're a leading multiracial company, how do you keep at that and keep informing as you move into the now and the future?
Dan, thanks for that question. I mean, that always poses a challenge, I think, for all leaders in an organization as we, continue to push our organizations forward in trying to create that change. I think Commissioner Lindsay had mentioned, and Dr. Hampton, you can try to imagine or be the one that comes up with the change, but to actually get it implemented and working, you really need the buy-in of your whole team and how you get that communicated and get their input so everybody's participating in that process. So, for people in for our company in particular, one of the things I really try to focus on is keeping people focused on our core purpose of building better lives and the values that we use for our organization of integrity and pride, where the values are integrity, professionalism, respect, ingenuity, and determination. And using those to carry the organization forward, and then also getting people involved in the changes that we have going on with the organization, and also just gauging on how that's going. So one of the tools we use to help manage our business is using the tools that a book called Traction had developed. It's called the Eos Entrepreneurial System. It uses really a lot of business techniques from other business gurus and makes it simpler for smaller and medium-sized businesses to really implement. So that's one of the critical things that any business needs to really move an organization forward. And then when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, for some businesses it might be new. For ours, that was always our DNA since my father was a minority, and coming up through the construction industry and being involved. I think, from my perspective, the thing I kind of developed is the commitment that, because we're minority and we're second generation and looked as a leader, and one of the biggest, though when you really look at the whole universe, we're still relatively small. How do we carry that forward? So one of the things is making sure that, when we have opportunities, that we're really trying to engage with other minority and women businesses in both the projects that may have goals put together, but even in projects that don't have goals. So that's one of the things we really try to implement, and that I would encourage others to try to do as well. And then also, as a general contractor, we're typically only performing up to 80% of the work. A lot of the other work is done by trade partners or subcontractors and suppliers, and then leaning on them as well and seeing what are they doing to help create opportunities for women, minority, and other diverse firms. And another thing I think I've seen is, with the government programs and some of the corporate programs, they set goals. So are these goals that are, you achieve and then you stop because you made the goal? Or are these goals that you set and you want to try to overachieve? So I know Commissioner Lindsay is nodding his head, because one of the things he had done is set some pretty high goals for minority and women utilization in construction projects in the Twin Cities area. And you look at what's available and it might not match up, but if you don't set these higher bar expectations, you'd never reach it, because you're always hitting that, I made the goals and then we can stop. I think another thing too is on the minority business and diverse utilization, or for corporations and even for public agencies, is they have goals, but is there incentive to overachieve the goals? So I know with Hennepin County, who's moved to a best value selection process in the construction space, which others can use for their procurement, they have goals for inclusion that if you meet them, you get a certain number, but if you overachieve, you get additional points. So that's another creative way to try to drive additional change and motivate people to participate and get that development. As far as creating change overall, it's my push within the organization to keep that top of mind. So we have internal reporting around it for ourselves, working with other organizations. My participation with META is to help support that organization, but then also hopefully be a role model to some people, since we are relatively successful as a minority business and a second generation that's made that ownership change as well, as a family business. And then at the national level, and then locally, participating with the state, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, they've got an initiative around diversity, equity, and inclusion, both through the Minnesota Chamber itself, its foundation, and trying to create best practices. There's a lot of great procurement organizations, both locally and nationally. Locally, there's the North Central Minority Supplier Development Council, which is part of the National Minority Supplier Development Council, to help corporations use best practices in their supplier diversity. And for the larger corporations that are really geared toward it, there's even an organization called the $1 Billion Roundtable, which are for organizations that have spent over $1 billion in contracting on the first tier basis, meaning direct contracts with minority and women-owned businesses. So, being able to share those resources, guide people on some best practices, share our experiences, are some of the ways that we try to help promote and emphasize the importance of working with minority and women in diverse firms.
Thank you for that. Before I turn to Commissioner Lindsay, I want to highlight everyone, if you have some specific questions that you would like to ask any of the panelists or all three of them, please start dropping them in the Q&A. Or in the chat, and I will be sure to bring those forward in the final minutes that we have. Turning to Commissioner Lindsay, I recognize through your work, both in the public sector, now humanities sector, like you've worked on the compliance side, and now you're sort of appealing to some of these universal values. But the baseline of all of this is that we're not just a healthier society, but that we build out a marketplace that actually advances all those who live in that marketplace. And so it's not about getting people to comply as much as it's about helping people to understand the opportunities, the almost limitless opportunities if we invest in the people in the communities and the organizations that will better round out our actual market competitiveness, as well as just our ability to serve all of our citizens. And so sort of all waters rise. Now that's just my own little riff to setting you up, Kevin, for you to kind of talk about whatever you want in this final leg here. But I just find you to be a fascinating leader who lives in this dance between compliance and like, this is just best practices at humanity. And the marketplace will flourish if you're more competitive with all that builds out our society. So any thoughts that you have on that before we turn to Q&A?
Sure. So when we adjusted, the Department of Human Rights adjusted workforce participation goals, I would be asked to talk about what we were trying to accomplish. And one of the books that I would reference at that particular point in time was a book called The Coming Jobs War. And it was by the president of Gallup, a gentleman by the name of Joe Clifton. And within that book, this is actually the first term of the Obama administration is when it was published. He talked about the challenge that was coming, and you could see it because you can talk about the changing age demographics across the globe. So he was comparing industrialized societies, and he was saying at that point in time, the United States has a chance to really own the next century if it can figure out an immigration policy, if it can figure out how to ensure that all children of color and indigenous children, because they're going to comprise more and more of the adult working class, how they can be intentionally involved and really prosper and see their vision and their dreams. And then you have to have a stable institutional base within your country. And that's a system of laws and institutions. So he was really setting the table for how the United States is so properly positioned to be very successful economically. Well, let me translate that back to the goals. When we adjusted the workforce goals, you could see by 2035, 25 to 30%, no matter what industry, would need to be pulling from communities of color to be able to sustain and maintain themselves. And then when we take a look at entry-level jobs within the area of construction, because you don't have to have a JD, you don't have to have a medical degree, that some of these industries would be more ripe for people of color to enter into. So for the success of the industry, how do we reframe this conversation? The other piece from the Coming Jobs War is a fact that I use, and since you mentioned the Federal Reserve talks about GDP, gross domestic product. So when we take a look at the 20 largest regions, population-wise, we see the Twin Cities typically coming in at about 17th or 18th, somewhere within that span. But when we take a look at the largest 20 by population, and we look to see their GDP output, we fight above our weight. In essence, we generally are between 11 and 14 as a region. So what does that tell us? That tells us the historical formula for the metropolitan area that we are in is that we have somehow figured out how to maximize the efficiency of human capital. So this isn't about checking off a box. This is coming back to a formula which has been successful in the past, is really maximizing the human capital of all the people that are within the metropolitan region. So if we're looking at it from that frame point, how do we maintain our institutions so that they are viewed as valuable? How do we ensure that that next class of citizens that are coming in as workers have meaningful opportunities, business opportunities to start new careers in various fields? If we win that, we as a region win the next 50, 100 years. So I think this is the piece of, to me, how all these pieces are coming together. What Tanya said about finding your voice, I can't say enough about the people that we work with feeling tension in and around not being able to find their voice. There's a lot which has been written concerning sexual harassment in the workforce and why complaints don't come forward to a large degree, either by what is said or informally. People don't feel that it will be really taken seriously. They don't really feel that decisions will be made to stop it from occurring. how do we ensure, and that's just one example, of folks being able to have their voice. At the Minnesota Humanities, we had a Stand Up and Roar event. So this was an event that we had for Hmong women, being able to express themselves and being able to write from their narrative. And it was very telling how they felt, sometimes stifled. And this, now we're talking not about sexual harassment, just stifled within the broader society and not being able to have their voice heard. So how can we all be very intentional in that space and allow more people to have that opportunity?
Thank you for that. Just a note to everybody, Dr. Hampton is experiencing what, I need to create a book called Zoomology. She's experiencing what we call meltdown. So I'm not sure if we'll be able to get her back into our webinar or not. If we do, great. If not, let's just keep going until the noon hour with Hoyt and Commissioner Lindsay with some open Q&A. I think just leveraging what Commissioner Lindsay just said, to both of you then, it feels to me like there's a gap of imagination of companies and leaders to actually first get honest about this identity question. You know, obviously this latest political season has been painful, and we're as divided as ever in terms of like how we generally understand political framing, and politics relate to immigration, they relate to policies. But we also know that there's gradations, right? From the hard edges to the more messy middle, where there's a lot of people in that middle that are actually more open to how do we bridge these differences and build a better society. So in that space, I just want to talk about it in that space. What are some sort of ways that there continue to be this evolution, particularly, again, I'm a white straight male. How can the larger white construct, which interesting historically has melted together from multiple cultures to become white, begin to continue to unpack how culture and identity of those who are non-white actually represent incredible opportunities, incredible innovations, incredible capacities, and sort of step away from that fear-based racial, it almost feels like a racial tension, and at times there's racial war that's a part of our history as a country, that yes, we have to wrestle with that, but let's now pivot and turn and do this thing. So that's a very broad question, I know, and maybe it's a little bit too mushy, but it does intersect at that point of like when you're in the office and politics come up and policy comes up, how can we help company leaders invest more time in speaking to the history, painting a new vision, and seeing identity actually as a really important way to change the narrative?
I appreciate the question there. I got a chance to see the historian John Meacham, and I think it's also within his program. I can't remember if it's on Netflix or the other Amazon Prime, in which he talks about too often within our political process now, people will just immediately assign it's in this bucket, or it's in this bucket, or this partisan bucket, therefore I don't need to listen. And what he says is, this is not rocket science by any means, but it's critically important. It's really important for us to have times in which we can listen to the other person and just say, huh, hadn't thought about that. That's kind of an interesting idea. And that's the space where the democracy, that's really where the coalition, that's where the compromise and opportunity and the promise of democracy really happens, is what he says, is in that moment say, huh, hadn't thought about that. So I give that to you because in each of our little smaller circles, this is not sort of like in the big body politic, there will be times in which we will be part of conversations. There will be part of, in the smaller settings, an opportunity to be upstanders and just encourage folks to stop and say, huh, hadn't thought about that. Or when you hear folks, is this something is worth listening to, sort of what you were saying? That's a small incremental step, but I would say it's a very powerful incremental step, and unfortunately one that we have forgotten over time. The other thing I think about history, and it is really important, and I think I'll give you an analogy of sort of, I've been very blessed and fortunate to have 3 children. And to the extent that I don't recognize a mistake in the past and I just blaze over it, your kids are going to call you on that. You didn't know anyone who has been blessed and fortunate to have kids understands that dynamic. What I think is interesting, though, is that too often we leave, right? And we're into the big body politic, and we don't think we have to talk about history. We just think that the other side has forgotten all of that. Well, why would that be, right? So I think for us, we need to be honest with our history and see opportunities to move forward. Many people, I'm sure, we did a program on the lynchings in Duluth. I'm sure many people were unaware of that history. And that's not to denigrate the entirety of individuals who were non-Black within Minnesota, but it is just simply to honor and sort of recognize that point in time and understand. And I think for many folks, when Dr. Bill Green said that a birth of a nation was actually spoken as the truth from the Minneapolis superintendent back in 1915, that really changes the dynamic of sort of how we understand race, because it was actually embraced, not, you know, Joe in the pub. This was actually the leader of the Minneapolis superintendent for the school district.
Right. Thank you for that. I want to acknowledge the time, and we have Dr. Tanya Jackman Hampton back on through phone. So thank you for navigating the rewiring, Tanya, to get you back on. It feels like we need to wrap up. There was one key question I just want to bring, and I don't know if you could put in your final thoughts, but we have a question that basically is, you know, we know that, I'll rephrase it, that relationships are what build business. And the question is, how can we continue to expand and challenge our relational and sort of social networks to broaden, to be more inclusive? So maybe through your final comments and wrap up, if you could just speak to any final thoughts that you have on this concept of institutional change. And if you could toss in there some of your thinking about, well, how do we expand our networks? I think that would be a wonderful plus. Hoyt, why don't we have you go first, since Dr. Hampton just got back on and is probably just trying to get regrounded in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have two comments, or two points. One is, you know, if you're trying to create change, especially around supplier diversity, and you know why that would be important. There's an article in the Harvard Business Review that just came out here in August of 2020 that kind of gives a quick summary of the history of it and what the benefits are. And a lot of it goes back to that diversity of ideas and thoughts. Just like participating with Gallup, they have the 34 Clifton strengths, with 34 different strengths for people, and how to create positive teams, you want a diversity of those strengths. I think they look at that as supplier diversity as well, and creating more opportunities and getting some ideas from others. As far as being a leader and stepping out, I think one of the things is, you know, look for those potential opportunities to be able to connect with either minority or women leaders, or if you're in the procurement area, those organizations that help promote diversity with minority or women-owned firms. And that would be my last two.
That's great. Thank you. No, that's terrific. That's terrific. Dr. Hampton, any final thoughts before we sign off today?
Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you great.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, I want to apologize for the technology circumstances. It's been a heck of a day. You know, sometimes those snakes just get in and you can't do anything about them. But what I would say is that from an institutional perspective and addressing that institution-wide or across different institutions, and to your point, networking, I think that we need to look at our communities of practice that have been coming together, and make sure that we are collectively working towards an end together. You know, so there are not lots of duplication, and within that there are only a few ways that have been working. Meanwhile, we've got individuals trying to contribute, but there's not much headway that's been made. And so I don't know that I would agree that we are sharing practices where we could be, to be able to eliminate that duplication, and certainly also to have a set of forces headed in the right direction such that we are impacting the institutional isms, racisms that we need to address, systemic racism that exists in organizations. The second thing I would say is that we need to be keen to understanding where we are making progress and how through looking at and reviewing the metrics that we have access to, so that we can know what worked and what didn't work, and make sure that we continue to repeat, obviously, those things or learn from our lessons. And then finally, we need to just be okay with talking and having the conversation around equity, and recognizing that if we're having a personal challenge, that's some homework that we need to do ourselves. And also, if we are interacting with others that maybe are triggering us, realizing that too might have something to do with ourselves. And we, you know, as I'll speak to my own sort of self, along with people who look like me, sometimes I have found even I get upset, and or I've watched my other Black colleagues get upset about a particular topic, and that's important, but doing it in a way that can be effective is what's necessary. I have told myself, if somebody's talking to me about the issue of race and what has happened, try not to turn on my own negative energy louder for the person that I'm interacting with, because that might actually interfere with their ability or desire to want to engage in creating change. And so while I might be upset, while I might be frustrated, I have to also remind myself that I can't blame the person in front of me who might be asking me a question at which they're asking me to respond on behalf of all Black folks, so to speak. And that I need to remind myself that and remind them that I'm only one vessel. So with that, that's what I would add.
That is incredible. Everything you just said, again, thank you for dancing between what leaders need to do and how institutions can bring change. That was wonderful. Thank you. Well, Commissioner Lindsay, if you could wrap up with any final thoughts, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So I do think that it's important to provide some support and have opportunities to learn from others. And that's not just simply at the CEO or senior leadership. So we're part of a true partnership that is transforming rural understanding of equity with the Blandon Foundation. So we've had about 100 to 120 individuals who participated in it. It's a good information share, safe space for folks to ask questions about how to motivate. It doesn't have to be true, but I would encourage the leadership to figure out how their leaders within their organization can be in such space. I put within the chat our annual celebration, virtualmhc.org. If you go to that, you'll get an opportunity to hear 3 essayists, poets, artists talk about this just, curious, connected, compassionate society. I offer that up because you as leaders, we also need to recharge our batteries. So take some time, envision, have time to innovate, think differently out of a paradigm. That's really important. The other piece is this space here is some sharing between CEOs and leaders is also critically important. So it takes some time for that. And then lastly, the third thing that I would say is we are all under an amazing amount of stress and change. Most of us aren't over 100 years old. So this is our first pandemic. So how are we dealing with that and also providing context for change? So appreciating how you can bring a lot of value to everybody within your organization and taking time to provide context for where you are going. So those would be my 3.
Thank you so much for those final thoughts, and I hope that everyone will use those resources as well as the many others mentioned in here. And the Downtown Council staff will provide links to those resources when they post this later. Well, it looks like we lost Dr. Hampton again. It's been a rough day for her, but thank you, Dr. Tanya Jackman Hampton. Thank you, Hoyt Chow. Thank you, Commissioner Kevin Lindsay, for being incredible leaders who help our broader Minnesota landscape continue to advance. Thank you for the organizations you lead and what they bring to bear within our culture and society. We're grateful for this investment of time, and I know that we're better for it, and we've been equipped for all that's in front of us. So thank you. So on behalf, and now to everybody who's been a part of this webinar or took time to watch it, on behalf of Steve Kramer, the CEO, all of the staff of the Minneapolis Downtown Council, and our membership and board, thank you for spending this time to help Minnesota and Minneapolis, and especially downtown Minneapolis, become a more diverse and inclusive and equitable environment where all can call it their downtown. Have a great day, take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you all.
Hi, thank you.
I know.